Today we are on 666. That's the only thing we're going to talk about, except that I never just talk about that. Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. And we'll remind ourselves of the basics here, and then we'll start looking at this number. It says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate or reckon the number of the beast. For the number is a human number. His number is 666. Now that's parallel to the statement in verse 10, which ends the first half of the chapter. If anyone has an ear, let him hear, verse 9. And then we have, if anyone is leading into captivity, then to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with a sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and faith of the saints. So at the end of the first section, we have a call to listen to the assurance of the eye for eye and tooth for tooth justice of God. Anybody who leads to captivity will be led to captivity. Anybody who kills will be killed. And here at the end of this section, again, these two sections are parallel. Verses 1 to 10 is parallel to verses 11 to 18. We have the statement, "Here is wisdom." Listen up. This is something. Let him who has understanding, who has wisdom, who has insight, reckon up the number of the beast. Now, there's already a slight clue here in the fact that the words wisdom and understanding are used. When you hear the words wisdom and understanding, what book of the Bible do you think of? Proverbs. And Proverbs is written by Solomon to instruct Rehoboam, who did not learn from it. We know that as soon as Rehoboam became king, he continued the tyrannical practices of his father. He did what his father did instead of doing what his father said. His father told him to learn the book of Proverbs, but his father behaved as a tyrant, as we'll see in just a moment. And Rehoboam imitated what his father did instead of what his father said. Hope my boys don't do that, but at any rate. So already we are looking at that part of the Bible which has wisdom. If it said go to the law or something, we would be pointed back toward Moses. Here we're pointed to the kingdom period. And as we've already seen, the number 666 comes from the reign of Solomon. So all of this tends to dovetail. It says, let him reckon the number of the beast, that is, figure it out. We've looked at the fact that the beast has a name and a mark and a number, and they correspond to one another. There are 3 names of God that we have as Christians. According to chapter 3, verse 12, we have the name of God, we have the name of the city, and we have Jesus' name written on us, tattooed on us. The name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, and my new name. Those are the 3 names we have. And in the counterfeits of these, we'll have the name of the beast and the name of the harlot, which is also the beast image. And then we'll have the name of the land beast or false prophet. Now, we're not actually given any particular names for the beast and the land beast, but we are given the city's name, New Jerusalem, and the name of the harlot is Mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of the abominations of the land. So there's that name. And each of these names is also a number. And we are given the number of this beast, which is 666, of the sea beast. Not of the land beast, but of the sea beast, of Rome. But then we're told that the number is that of man. And as I mentioned before, in Greek you've got 2 words for man, just as we do by implication in English. We talk about a man, we mean a man in contrast to a woman. And then we talk about man or mankind, we mean humanity. The Greek actually has 2 words for that. The word anir means a man as opposed to a woman, a masculine human being. And the word anthropos means a human being. The word here is anthropos. It doesn't say the number of a particular person. And although it's possible that this means the number of a particular person. It's very unlikely, because almost certainly you'd have the word aner instead of the word anthropos here, if that were the case. Thus, it is much, much more likely that what this says is the number is that of mankind, or, just to put it even simpler, the number is a human number. It's not an angelic number. It's not a divine number. It's a human number. It has to do with what humanity in its essence is. And the number is 666. Now, just tell me right off the bat, how do you get from the essence of humanity to the number 666? Or at least start us down that road. Yeah, man was made on the sixth day. So, in a sense, this gets real easy to start with. Man is made on the sixth day, so that's the human number. Only this is 666. But it starts off by saying it's a human number. Now, I've also told you that in the book of Revelation, the word anthropos is used consistently for the Jewish people. You've got the land and the sea. The land is the Jews. The sea is the Gentiles. On the land dwell anthropoi, mankind. And on the sea dwell the nations, the peoples, the tribes, and the tongues. 7 times we've seen that phrase, nations, people, tribes, and tongues. Tribes, tongues, nations, peoples. But when you read about man or men, it's always in connection with the land. So the number is a human number. The number is a Jewish number, even though it represents the Roman Empire. It represents the beast. It is a number that comes up from the Jewish history. Why? Well, once again, because the Hebrews, Israelites, Jews were set up by God to be models of humanity. Models of humanity. The first man was Adam. Adam represented the human race. When Adam sinned, we all fell into sin. He dragged himself and Eve and all the rest of us down with him when he sinned. Eve didn't drag him down, he dragged her down. Eve slipped. Adam sinned with a high hand. Adam represents humanity. Now, throughout the Old Testament, there are a whole series of new Adams. Noah is a new Adam. Every high priest is a new Adam. Every king in Israel is a new Adam. They are all representative men. Each of the judges is a new Adam, except Deborah. She's a new Eve. But Barak is a new Adam. Barak is associated with Deborah. That's how you read these stories. Each one of these stories shows us a little bit more about who Adam is and who Jesus is. They all point back to Adam. They all point forward to Jesus. When David does good things, he's like Jesus. When David sins, he's like Adam. So if you want to understand original sin, the way to do it is to start with Adam's sin and then look at the sins of Ham and the sins of Abraham and the sins of Esau. And each representative person in the Old Testament gives you more information about the sin of Adam. And if you want to understand what Jesus did, you look again. Everything in the Old Testament, all the righteous and good things that certain people do, give you more pictures of what Jesus does. You don't just look at the Gospels. The Gospels are just the climax of this revelation. So, the Jews were set aside to be this kind of representative humanity. God called Abraham to do that and circumcised him and set him apart to be a priest to the nations, to represent the nations, to pray for the nations. Remember when Abimelech sinned in Genesis 20, God comes to Abimelech and says, Abraham is a prophet, appeal to him and he will pray for you. Abraham represents the nations to God. The Jews offered all these 70 bulls for the 70 nations of the world at the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Jews represent the world. They are representative men. So to say that the number is a human number or to say that the number is a Jewish number means that the number sums up Adamic humanity and its sin. And the great picture of Adamic humanity and its sin is the history of Israel. The history of Israel shows the greatness of sin. Romans 9, 10, and 11 tell us this. Remember in Romans 9, 10, and 11, God says about Pharaoh, he said, I raised you up that I might display my wrath. And then that is applied to Israel. And God says basically, I raised Israel up so that I might display my wrath. Israel shows the grace of God, but even more, Israel shows the wrath of God and is a warning to everybody else. And that's exactly what's happening in Revelation. The destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of Judaism, is a warning to the 7 churches. So this number is Jewish in the sense that the Jews concentrate and exemplify humanity, and the Jews exemplify the sinfulness of humanity. Why were the Jews worse than every other nation in the ancient world? Why did the Jews become the examples of God's wrath? Very simple reason. I'm sure you know what it is. Yeah, they had more truth, and so they had more to rebel against. You see, we hate God. So the more we learn about God, the more there is to hate. If you only know this much about God, you can only sin this much. But if God gives you this much revelation, then you've got that much to rebel against. And the Jews had more light than any other nation, and so their rebellion was greater than any other nation. And their rebellion becomes progressive in the Old Testament. When God gives them the Mosaic Law, they had this much to rebel against. When God adds to it, the books down to Jeremiah, then they have this much to rebel against, and God destroys them and takes them into captivity. But when they get the entire Old Testament all the way down to Malachi, they have this much to rebel against. So they become even worse. Every time God tells them more, they get worse. I mean, they start off okay, and, for the saints, it's great to have more. But for those who rebel, they have more to rebel against, and so they become even worse. The more light you have, the greater your sin is. Now, in the Old Testament, who had the most light of anybody in the entire Old Testament? Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. So Solomon's rebellion is the greatest rebellion in the entire history of the Old Testament. The more you know, the more you've got to rebel against. If you're not regenerated, the more God tells you about himself, that just gives you new things to hate. Solomon knew more than anybody else, and so Solomon's rebellion is greater than anybody else's. He rebels against the most light. And so his sin is the exemplary sin of man in rebellion against God. And that's the number 666. Solomon rebelled against the greatest light. He is the perfect example of Adamic rebellion raised to the max. And so the number associated with his rebellion becomes the number of man in his beastitudinousness, his bestiality. What does it mean to be a beast? Who was the first man who became a beast? Adam. Adam became a beast. Why? Because he listened to a beast. He put himself under the authority of a beast. And so God clothed him in skins of beasts and said, you're a beast. There's an element of redemption there. God kills the animal to give him the skins. But, Adam goes out looking like a beast because he's got skins of a beast on him. Why? Because he hearkened to the voice of a beast. And he made himself a beast. Nebuchadnezzar is made to behave like a beast. And he's insane on and off for 7 years, during which time Daniel ruled the empire. Wasn't all that bad, was it? But many times in the Old Testament, people become like beasts. Well, Solomon is the most Adamic of men. He is Adam in all of his splendor. Adam with more wisdom than Adam had. What did Adam do in the garden before Eve came along? What was he doing? Naming the animals. And we're told about Solomon what that corresponds to that. Remember? Yeah, Solomon wrote all these books of trees and animals and things, and named all these different things. This is 1 Kings 4:29. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind, like the sand that's on the seashore. So remember, the sand of the seashore is the symbol for the host of Israel. Solomon had all the wisdom and discernment and breadth of mind of all of Israel. He had everything that Israel was to have. And Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east, that is, the Ishmaelites, and all the wisdom of Egypt. So you see, the greatest wisdom becomes the greatest rebellion. You have the most to rebel against. He was wiser than all men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was known in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs. His songs were 1,005. We only have one or two of them. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. And men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So that's who this guy was. Super Adam. Naming animals. Got all the wisdom. Got himself a nice wife. Princess of Egypt. There's a whole book in the Bible about Solomon and the princess of Egypt. Here, the Song of Solomon. Just Adam and Eve all over again. And then he falls into sin. So he is the perfect exemplar of man, of Jewish man, the example of man, the perfect example of Adam, and his number is 666. And let's think back to the sixth day now. Is there something wrong with being a 6? I don't think so. Every now and then you will hear commentators say, well, man was just a 6. He was supposed to be a 7, but he was just a 6. And 6 is man and his inadequacy and sin. That's what the number 6 represents. Well, that can't be so. Because at the end of the sixth day, God saw everything he'd made, and behold, it was very good. So 6 is okay, but 6 is not the end. 6 is supposed to go to 7. What are some examples of this? Adam was supposed to be a priest to guard the garden, but he was supposed to mature to where he ruled over the land. Adam was given the tree of life, remember? Of every tree you may freely eat except the tree of knowledge. But God also said all the trees will be food for you, so he's supposed to mature to where he got the tree of knowledge. As we study this out in the Bible, we find that Adam was made a priest who was to mature into being a king. Because knowledge of good and evil, that phrase is associated with kings. So it's perfectly fine to be a 6, but you're supposed to grow into being a 7. Now, how do you do that? What is this arrow here between 6 and 7, between life and knowledge, between priest and king? What was Adam supposed to do? Well, he was supposed to be faithful. He was supposed to trust God and keep his hands off the tree of knowledge. And he didn't do it. He was supposed to be faithful. And if he'd been faithful, he would have gone from 6 to 7. He would have gone from ruling the garden to ruling the whole world. He would have added knowledge of good and evil, that is, the right to rule and exercise dominion, to life. He would have gone from being a priest to a king. He would have been glorified. Even in our culture, when you think of a priest, how do you think of him being dressed? In a black robe. And when you think of a king, how do you think of him being dressed? Yeah, with gold crown and everything else. See, even in our tradition, we have maintained the idea that the priest is a man who serves others. He wears a slave collar around his neck because he's a slave of Christ. He's a slave of the people. And he conceals his glory, but the king has glory. The king, the glory is manifested. So this was the progression. But because humanity sinned and was unfaithful, they got stuck here at the 6th point. So the 6 just becomes more 6-y. And the idea of 666 is you are stuck in 6. We're not maturing to 7. That's part of the meaning of it. That's one of the roots in this notion here. That 6 is man stuck in his childhood, stuck at the priestly level and not maturing because he sinned. And that becomes perverse. A second background to this number 666 lies in the giants of the Old Testament. I think we ought to mention that. The giants that had to be fought by David are associated with the number 6. 1 Samuel 17, verse 4. Notice this. 1 Samuel 17:4, a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath. Goliath of Gath. Remember, that's Golgotha. Whose height was 6 cubits in a span. 6 cubits in a span. That's about 10 feet tall. But once again, the number 6 shows up here. We're specifically told that. And in verse 7 says, the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. So the number 6 comes up again. And his shield carrier also walked before him. So the number 6 associated with the giants. And then there is another passage in 2 Samuel 21, 20 to 22. And what does that passage tell us? There was war in Gath again, where there was a man of great stature, had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. He was also born to the giant. So again, the number 6 comes up. Somebody that has to be slain. The beast. The beast is like these giants. And the giant theme is real big in the Old Testament. What was it that scared the Jews off from taking the promised land in the first place? Giants. And when Moses gets around to preaching to them at the end, he starts making fun of them because they were scared of those giants. Deuteronomy chapter 2. Listen to how Moses does this here in his sermon. He's describing the wilderness wanderings. Deuteronomy 2, verse 8. We passed beyond our brothers, the sons of Esau, who lived in Seir, away from the Arabah road, away from Elath and from Ezion-Geber, and we turned and passed through the wilderness of Moab. Then Yahweh said to me, don't harass Moab, nor provoke them to war, for I have not given you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the sons of Lot as a possession. Now then he says this, the Emim lived there formerly, a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. In other words, the Moabites drove out their giants, but you were scared to drive out your giants. Then he goes on. Verse 17, the Lord spoke to me, saying, you shall cross over Ar, the border of Moab, today, and when you come opposite the sons of Ammon, do not harass them or provoke them, for I will not give you any of the land of the sons of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession. Then he says, it is also regarded as the land of the Rephaim, for Rephaim formerly lived in it, but the Amorites call them Zamzumim. Well, then they do destroy giants. Then they go to war against Og, king of Bashan. And Og, king of Bashan, had a bed that was 9 cubits long, which is 14 feet long. So then they do go and start destroying giants at the end of the 40-year wandering. But you see, in order for Jerusalem to be taken, you got to get rid of all the rest of the giants. So in David's day, we finally get rid of all the giants. David and his mighty men destroy Goliath and the other 4 giants. You all know why David picked up 5 stones. Because there were 5 giants out there. It was Goliath, and he had 2 brothers, and there were 2 others who would have been his blood avengers. And so it was entirely possible that once Goliath was struck down, one of the others would jump up to avenge him. So David goes out there prepared, and we're told here in 2 Samuel 21, verse 22, that there were 4 born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and the hand of his servants. So there were 5 altogether. Once those giants have been destroyed, those 6s, then Jerusalem can become the capital. Then you can make Jerusalem into the glorious city. You got to kill the giants to take the land. You got to finish killing the giants to have the capital city. What's happening in the book of Revelation? What has to happen before the New Jerusalem? You got to deal with the beast and the harlot. You got to deal with the 666. So you got to deal with the giant before Jerusalem. You got to deal with the Goliath, his 6, and his cousin who has 6 fingers, and Goliath with his 600 shekel spear. You got to deal with all those 6s before you can have the city. In Revelation, we're going to have to deal with the 666, the beast, the false prophet, the harlot, before we have the New Jerusalem. Same motif, same theme. God will destroy, and then the New Jerusalem can come. I want to go to one other background passage before we come back to Solomon, and that's Daniel chapter 3, and this is important. Daniel 3, and let me just read this and look at what's here and how it's relevant. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. Got the connection? 60 by 6. Now this is not a statue of a human being. The proportions are wrong. It's probably an obelisk. You all know what an obelisk is? The Washington Monument is an obelisk. An obelisk is a long, tall, thin pyramid. So it's a ladder to heaven or a holy mountain. So you start off with your little pyramid up here at the top, and then you make it real tall. And that's what it is. It's a ladder to heaven. It's a holy mountain. So he makes one of these, and its dimensions are 60 by 6. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, and the treasurers, and the judges, and the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the moment you hear the sound of horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you're to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at the time when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You yourself, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews that you've appointed over the administration province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have disregarded you. They do not serve the gods or worship the golden images you've set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when these men were brought before the king, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire, and what God is there that can deliver you out of my hand?" Now, I went through this because, is this a counterfeit of? We have a ladder that goes to heaven, a furnace of fire out in front of it, and an orchestra of musicians all around it. What is it? It's a counterfeit of the temple. It's a big open-air temple. If you read the book of Chronicles, you have a list of all the people that are supposed to be gathered around. When the temple worship takes place, you got to have the gatekeepers and the singers and the musicians and the army commanders, and all this is all listed. And the same thing happens here, all these different lists of people. And then you have the delineations of the Levitical orchestra. And when the Levitical orchestra plays, that's when the sacrifice is offered. We don't want to go back into Chronicles and find all those verses. And I know 1 Chronicles is not the book you're most familiar with, but believe me, it's there. When the music plays, that's when the sacrifice is offered. What we have here is a big open amphitheater, which is a temple. And you have a symbol of the ladder to heaven, which is the tabernacle or temple itself, representing how you connect to God. And out in front of it, you have this big altar of fire. And that's the picture. Now, let's just remember what's going on here. You either worship this image or you die. And the image is 60 by 6. That's exactly the same thing that's happening in Revelation 13. He provides that no one should be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, the number, or the name of the beast. If you don't have 666, you can't buy and sell. But buying and selling means what? Worship. It means you can't participate. Ultimately, it means they kill you. Because that's actually what happens in Revelation chapter 11. They kill the 2 witnesses. And that's what happens in chapter 14. They kill the 144,000. The land beast deceives those who dwell on the land to make an image of the sea beast. Here, Nebuchadnezzar makes an image. He's deceived by the Chaldeans into doing it. He causes as many as who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Nebuchadnezzar says anybody who doesn't worship this 60 by 6 is going to be killed. So you see the parallels here. We're looking at a new Nebuchadnezzar, a new Solomon, a new Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar sets up this false worship, and Solomon, in his apostasy, goes into it. And Nebuchadnezzar is just a 66, 60 by 6. Solomon, however, had more wisdom than Nebuchadnezzar, and he was 666. Any questions about Daniel 3 and the Nebuchadnezzar motif background here? This is all in our mind now as we read this. We should say, oh yes, that's what Nebuchadnezzar did, the world emperor. But most particularly, it is what Solomon did. Now, let's focus in on Solomon and then we're done. Chapter 13, verse 2 of Revelation says, the dragon gave to the beast his power and throne and authority. So we have power, throne, and authority are the triune characteristics that are given to the beast by the dragon. Now these are the 3 characteristics of kingship: power, throne, and authority. Kings have these things, and they are 3 things that can be perverted. And now we go back to Deuteronomy 16, verses 16 and 17, and we find the laws of kingship. This is the most focused background to our passage. When you enter the land that Yahweh your God gives you and possess it and live in it, and you say, I would like to have a king over me like the nations who are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom Yahweh your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You shall not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not one of your brothers. So there will come a time when it's okay to have a king. And that will be the time when it's okay to have a temple and it's okay to have a city. And it's a long way off, but when that day comes, you can have a king, because you will have a capital city, and the tabernacle will become a temple. And you'll move from priest to king, and from 6 to 7, etc. Now, here are the 3 laws. The king will not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since Yahweh has said to you, you shall never again return that way. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Horses, chicks, and gold. What do horses have to do with? Power, throne, or authority? Yeah, the horses have to do with power. Which one has to do with throne? Gold or women? Women, because lots of women means lots of sons, and that's how you multiply your throne. And then finally, authority has to do with gold. Now, the reason for that is that God's temple is full of gold, and gold then is associated with authority for that reason. So that's what the king is going to be tempted to do, and kings always have been. Tempted to have a big military which can be used against your own people. Did that happen? Solomon have a big military that got used against his own people? Yes, because when Rehoboam became king and the northern tribes seceded, Rehoboam tried to use the army against the people of Israel to force them to come back. God told him he better not, and so he desisted. And of course, gold and women, always a problem. Problem with David. David started collecting women and set a kind of bad example for Solomon, who decided to have a lot more. Now, the reign of Solomon is easily divided into two phases. Solomon becomes king. He cleans up all the messes left over from David's reign. He judges wisely. Chapter 3 tells us the story about the two harlots and the child, famous story. And chapter 4 tells us how he set up the kingdom and how he had all these proverbs. And chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8 tell us about how he built the temple and consecrated it. And chapter 9 tells us a little bit more about all this. And chapter 10 tells us about the visit of the Queen of Sheba, which tells us that the Jews under Solomon are fulfilling their mission to witness to the Gentiles. The Gentiles are coming to hear the gospel. And the climax then is the departure of the Queen of Sheba, and then we have the fall of Solomon into sin. And Solomon breaks each of these three rules. And then after that, we read that the Lord was angry with Solomon, and he says, I'm going to raise up adversaries for you. And he raises up Hadad the Edomite, and he raises up Rezon the son of Eliada, and he raises up Jeroboam, and troubles Solomon for the rest of his reign. The fall of Solomon is in chapter 10, verse 14 to chapter 11, verse 8. Chapter 10, verse 14 starts off, Now the weight of gold that came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. And of course, that's our key verse. Beside that, from the traders and the wares and the merchants and the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country. There's all this other stuff too. And Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So all this gold was used to glorify his palace complex. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. And there were 6 steps to the throne, and a round top to the throne in its rear, and its arms on each side of 2 lions standing beside the arms. You got 2 cherubim on either side of God's throne. You got 2 lions on either side of Solomon's throne. Of course, lion is the house of Judah, so it's appropriate. 12 lions were standing there on 6 steps from one side to the other. I don't know if these were living lions or gold lions. It doesn't make any difference. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. The vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. None of it was silver. Silver wasn't even considered valuable in the days of Solomon. For the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish with ships of Hiram, and once every 3 years the ships of Tarshish came bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks, which everybody figures that these mines were located in Africa. And so we're always looking for King Solomon's mines down in Central Africa somewhere, where they were getting these gorillas, as well as all this gold and silver and ivory. And every 10 years somebody writes another novel about King Solomon's mines in Central Africa. 666 talents of gold. A talent is 100 pounds. So 100 pounds times 16 is 1,600. That's 16 ounces in a pound, so that's 1,600 ounces in a talent. How much is gold worth per ounce? Well, let's say 400. Let's say it's worth $400. It's always floating around here. For $640,000 per talent. And now we got 666 talents per year. $426,240,000 per year for a nation the size of New Jersey. And it's all going to the palace. It's going to Solomon. He's aggrandizing himself. That's too much. That's multiplying gold. We have broken one of the laws of kingship here. We are trying to get more authority than we should have. And you see, all of this is going to his palace, which is the center of his authority. It's going to his throne. The throne is what's described here. The association is with his authority. Then it says in verse 23, so Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear the wisdom that God has put in his heart. You see, when a man starts to sin, he doesn't fall all at once. He still has a lot of wisdom here, but he's making his big mistake. And they brought every man his gift, articles of silver and gold and garments and weapons and spices and horses and mules and much year by year. Now we read the second problem. Now Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen and had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He stationed them in chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Verse 28. Also, Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kuwait. And the king's merchants procured them from Kuwait for a price, and a chariot was imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. By the same means, they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. Now we got really stupid international trade arrangement here. Solomon's in the arms trade. Not only is he multiplying horses, 12,000 horsemen is way too many. Israel was not supposed to have aggressive war machine, and horses and chariots are only used in aggressive war. That's the only time they're used, is to go out and conquer. Defensive war means having high walls in your cities. Building the walls is what he should have been doing, not multiplying horses. The good kings build the walls. The bad kings multiply horses because they want to conquer other lands. Conquest is wrong. Not only does he multiply horses, but he starts getting involved in an arms trade, and he sells Egyptian horses to the Hittites and the Syrians, who in the next generation are going to start causing a lot of trouble for the kingdoms of Israel. Stupid. And then finally, the part we all marvel at, King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. From all the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, neither shall they associate with you. They will surely turn away your heart after their gods. So that was not said about Egypt, and that's why his marriage to the princess of Egypt is fine. Besides, she was a believer. But Solomon held fast to all these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned his heart away. It came about when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Malcham, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. He built a high place for Chemosh and for Molech. So, he is sinning against the three laws of kingship. Now all we need to do is go back to Revelation and see how this fits. All we have to do is remember that at this stage in history, the king is God's representative to protect the church. That's in Solomon's day. We move down to the next period, to the Restoration, and the world emperor is the one who's supposed to protect the church. Remember, the guardian empire. The guardian empire, which is Rome at this point, is the beast that God sets up to be a Doberman and protect the Jews. Earlier, Solomon as king was supposed to do that. And that's the parallel. Solomon's fall into sin is parallel to Nero's fall into sin. And when Nero stops protecting the church and turns against the church, Nero is falling into sin the same way Solomon did. And so the beast in his sin is like Solomon in his sin. He is rebelling against God's provisions, refusing to be humble under God and have one wife and a little gold and a few horses, and trust God to be his horses and chariots. What did they say about Elijah and Elisha? My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. The prophets were supposed to be the chariots and horsemen of Israel. Faithfulness. You put your trust in the Word of God, in the prophets, in God himself. He's your horses and chariots. But you stop trusting that and you start trusting real horses, and you get way more horses than you need. You need to have some, but you don't need to have a vast number. And you get lots of women and lots of gold, and that's what Solomon did. That's what Nero does. That's what Rome does. And that's why the beast is bad. So, here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding reckon up the number of the guardian beast. The guardian, that number is a Jewish number. It's a human number. And the number is 666. It's the number of Solomon in his failure to be a true guardian. And instead he becomes an oppressor. Puts the people up to forced labor and eventually splits the kingdom. So, that's the wisdom. Any questions real quick? Good. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for the wisdom that your word provides. Thank you that in Jesus we've moved from 6 to 7, that he has become king, that he has finished the work, that we're not stuck in an endless cycle of falling back into sin. We ask that you would protect us in our day, that you would be our true guardian, that Jesus would be our guardian, that he would be chariots and horsemen to protect us. We ask that you would convert the hearts of those who are like beasts today. Bring them back to you. Now prepare our hearts to worship you, if we pray in Christ's name. Amen.